The city of Chicago in the early 1890s did not know the man it was welcoming. It saw only another ambitious businessman, another stranger with a polite smile and steady gaze, another figure swallowed by the swelling crowds gathering for the great World's Fair. It did not know that behind his calm eyes, behind the absent-minded smoothing of his coat lapels, behind the doctor's soft and measured voice, something more calculating was taking shape. A design, both architectural and psychological. A place built not for comfort, nor for commerce but for control. His name was Henry Howard Holmes, and long before the newspapers would christen him with darker titles, he was simply a man who discovered early in life that other people's fear was an instrument, an invisible lever he could pull with little more than a word, a gesture, or the quiet tightening of a smile. He arrived in Chicago with a purpose, though no one around him would have recognized it at first. His steps were light, detached from worry, because he already carried within him the blueprint for something extraordinary. Holmes understood the city as an opportunity, chaotic enough to hide him, ambitious enough to justify his strange building plans, crowded enough to ensure that disappearing would feel normal, expected even. A person could vanish in Chicago in those days and become nothing more than smoke trailing upward from a factory chimney. Holmes bought a vacant lot in Inglewood, a place that existed on the edge of expansion, half wild with opportunity and half drowned in poverty. He introduced himself to locals as a doctor and pharmacist, polite and eager to improve the neighborhood. He shook hands with men who owned butcher shops and hardware stores, each handshake a silent promise that he was one of them. But even as he smiled, Holmes was measuring them, studying their posture, the weight of their steps, the frequency with which they blinked when nervous. He collected such details the way other men collected coins. No one suspected that the young doctor with the immaculate suit was a man rehearsing his own mythology. Construction began quickly. The structure that rose from the dirt was strange from the beginning. Workers complained that the plans changed constantly. Rooms were added, then abruptly sealed off. Staircases ended at blank walls. Corridors led nowhere. When a laborer questioned the design, Holmes would simply adjust his smile and offer a gentle explanation about future plans or architectural innovation. And if the questions persisted, the laborer would find himself dismissed the next morning, wages unpaid, his name already fading from Holmes's memory. Holmes preferred workers who didn't ask questions, men desperate for money, men who didn't wonder why someone would want a room with 2 doors and no windows, or why a hallway needed to be barely wide enough for a single person. They did not ponder why Holmes inspected the walls late at night, pressing his palm against the plaster as though listening for a heartbeat within. He did not call it the Murder Castle. That title would come later when the building became infamous. To him, it was simply the castle, a structure modeled as much from his imagination as from any blueprint. He walked through it like a conductor imagining music before it played. Every door had a purpose. Every hidden chute had a destination. Every soundproof room offered possibilities. When he spoke to neighbors, his voice never betrayed the thoughts winding through his mind like threads tightening around a spool. Chicago was a city on fire with opportunity. New businesses sprouted daily. People arrived by train, exhausted and eager, hauling with them suitcases filled with hope and clothing that smelled faintly of coal smoke. Holmes knew these transient souls well. Women seeking independence, men looking for work, travelers who carried with them the anonymity of strangers, people who could vanish without setting off alarms. He opened his pharmacy on the ground floor. Clean counters, polished bottles, the scent of medical tonics drifting outward to passers-by. Customers came in curious, then returned for the pleasant conversation, the carefully measured advice, the doctor's trustworthy smile. Holmes had a way of making others lean slightly closer when he spoke, as though confiding in them, as though they were chosen. And when he hired young women to work the counters or assist with bookkeeping, he chose those with weak ties to family, women whose absence might not immediately raise concerns. One such woman was Julia Connor. She arrived with her husband, End, and their young daughter, Pearl. Julia had a distant sadness in her eyes that Holmes recognized instantly, not because he empathized with it, but because he knew sadness made people malleable. He offered her work, and she accepted eagerly. He watched End struggle to find his place, watched the cracks form in their marriage, watched Julia drift closer to him with each passing week. Her gaze grew more trusting, her steps lighter when she approached him, and Holmes, as always, remained patient. Patience was his favorite tool. But the castle was not yet complete, not in its true purpose. Holmes began to design new spaces in his mind, additions to the second floor that would serve no tenant and no customer. He envisioned a labyrinth where every corridor felt subtly wrong, where a person might walk in circles without realizing it. He imagined doors that locked from the outside, vents that carried the faintest whisper of gas, chutes angled toward the basement where no one would hear screaming. Each feature hinted at something monstrous, yet Holmes considered them with the calm focus of an artist adjusting strokes on a canvas. At night, when Inglewood slept, he would walk through the unfinished hallways alone. His footsteps echoed strangely. The building seemed to breathe with him. He touched the doorknobs lightly, memorizing their texture, testing how quietly they turned. He ran a finger along the woodwork as though greeting an old friend. The workers thought him eccentric but harmless. They did not see the way his expression shifted in the shadows, the flicker of satisfaction that crossed his face when a hidden door swung shut without a sound. Holmes understood something fundamental about fear. It begins not with screams but with uncertainty, with not knowing which door leads to safety and which leads to something else entirely. When the world's Columbian Exposition approached in 1893, Chicago began to transform. Thousands flocked to the city, seeking cheap lodging near the fairgrounds. Holmes advertised rooms in his building, promising comfort and convenience. Strangers walked into the castle every day carrying luggage and leaving behind an address where no letters would ever arrive. But homicide was not a sudden revelation for Holmes. It was not an act of rage or madness. It was a progression, a refinement, a sharpening of instinct that he had honed long before Chicago ever met him. Julia was the first to vanish. She had grown too trusting, too affectionate, too entangled in Holmes's life. And Pearl, quiet and observant, had begun asking questions children were not meant to ask. Neighbors remembered Julia's smile, soft and hopeful. They remembered Pearl's tiny footsteps pattering across the street, but they did not remember them leaving. No luggage, no goodbyes, only silence. Holmes explained their disappearance with effortless composure. Julia had moved away. Pearl was with her. It was unfortunate, but life changed quickly in Chicago. People came and went all the time. No one questioned him deeply, not yet. The castle continued to grow. He added a walk-in vault to the second floor. Workers wondered why a doctor needed such a thing, but Holmes dismissed their concerns with charm. Confidential documents, valuable supplies, delicate equipment. The vault was lined with asbestos and sealed so tightly that no sound could escape. Holmes tested the door repeatedly, closing himself inside for minutes at a time. Standing in the darkness, he allowed himself to imagine the terror someone else might feel there, the slow rise of panic, the awareness of one's heartbeat pressing against the ribcage. He inhaled deeply, savoring the quiet. Holmes did not crave blood or violence. No, what he craved was control. The moment where another person's fate balanced entirely on his decision. He liked the way fear reshaped people, how it stripped them down to something primal and trembling. Control was the essence of every room he designed. The first night he tested the vault on another person, the castle felt different, as though the building itself was awakening. Holmes listened through the steel door, not with excitement but with clinical curiosity. Each muffled sound told him something. How long before panic set in when the banging began, how quickly breathing turned frantic. The vault was not just a tool. It was a classroom, a lesson in human fragility. He learned quickly. Word spread through Inglewood that Holmes's hotel was expanding again. New rooms, new tenants, new opportunities. Workers cycled in and out without realizing how little of the building truly belonged to them. Holmes hired carpenters to build a sealed room, then hired others later to build a hallway that disguised its presence. He intentionally kept his crews fragmented. No one saw more than a fraction of the whole. If they spoke to each other, their confusion only deepened. Once a carpenter remarked that the building was more maze than hotel. Holmes smiled politely and said the design was meant to impress guests. Privately, though, he considered the comment a compliment. The castle was a maze, one designed with exquisite care. Holmes's pharmacy flourished, but he spent less time behind the counter as the years passed. He preferred the upper floors, where no customers wandered. He moved like a phantom through the corridors, listening to the creaks of the floorboards and learning which rooms held warmth and which held chill. The castle was a living organism to him, one that required observation, tending, and the occasional alteration. By the time the World's Fair opened, tourists flooded the area in numbers unseen before. They came from every corner of the country, eyes wide with wonder, hearts swelling with hope. Many had little money and sought affordable rooms near the fair. Holmes welcomed them warmly, guided them upstairs with practiced hospitality, carried their luggage with careful hands. Some of those guests left the next morning. Some did not. The disappearances were subtle at first. A guest who checked in but never returned for their belongings. A young woman who told acquaintances she found work elsewhere. A man whose family assumed he had extended his travels. Chicago was too crowded, too chaotic, too transient for anyone to notice patterns. Holmes relied on this. He thrived on it. He kept a ledger in his private office, though the entries were cryptic, initials, dates, brief notes, nothing that could be easily understood by others. And in the basement, he began storing equipment that served no medical purpose but fascinated him with their potential. Furnaces, acids, dissecting tables, tools of transformation. The castle was no longer merely a building. It was a mechanism, a trap disguised as a home. Holmes moved through it with ease, while others walked its halls like flies caught in a web they did not see. But something strange began to happen after the first few vanishings. Holmes noticed it one evening as he stood at the top of the staircase, listening to the groan of the building beneath the wind. The corridors felt different. He could not explain it in words, but there was a subtle tension in the air, as though the castle itself was absorbing what happened inside it. Each room felt heavier, each shadow deeper. Holmes stood still, watching the flicker of gaslight on the walls, and for the first time he wondered whether a place could take on the nature of its owner, whether a building could become an extension of a man's mind. He brushed off the thought quickly. Holmes was not a man given to superstition, but as he descended the stairwell, he could not shake the sense that the darkness around him was listening. One night long after the city had quieted, Holmes walked through the second floor checking locks, examining doors, ensuring everything was exactly as he left it. He paused outside the vault, placing his hand against the cold steel. For a moment he felt a faint vibration from within, not a sound, but an echo, like a memory trapped in metal. Holmes smiled faintly. The castle was learning. He continued his rounds, his footsteps barely audible. The halls seemed to swallow sound. When he reached a narrow corridor that led to a sealed-off room, he paused again. The air was still, too still. He felt, for a fleeting moment, the sensation of being watched, not by a person, but by the structure itself. Holmes exhaled slowly, almost amused. The castle was becoming exactly as he intended. Behind him a faint creak echoed, a settling of wood, a whisper of shifting weight. Holmes did not turn around. He simply continued walking. The castle, after all, was alive. The World's Fair cast its glow across Chicago like a second sun, a shimmering beacon of invention, architecture, and hope. Millions walked through its gates, dazzled by electric lights and whitewashed palaces that reached toward the sky. But in Inglewood, only a few miles away, another structure was waiting, one far darker, one that did not celebrate the wonders of man, but rather the depths he could descend to. Holmes stood at the window of the castle's second floor, watching distant plumes of light shimmer above the fairgrounds. The illumination pleased him. People flocked to brightness like insects, never suspecting that true danger thrived in darkness. And darkness, he believed, was where he did his finest work. Guests came steadily now, young couples, traveling salesmen, women searching for employment near the fair. Many stayed only a night. Some stayed longer. A rare few ventured into parts of the building where Holmes preferred they did not go. For those individuals, Holmes had a quiet way of guiding them back, his hand on their shoulder, his voice warm yet firm. No one argued with the doctor. His politeness was heavier than most men's anger. But the castle had begun to play its own tricks. One evening, a guest reported hearing footsteps in a hallway that should have been empty, slow, deliberate footsteps, too measured to be casual. Holmes investigated without hesitation, allowing the guest to follow him. When he reached the far corridor, he opened each door with a flourish, revealing nothing but empty rooms. The guest apologized nervously, and Holmes assured her that old buildings made strange sounds. Yet when he closed the final door, Holmes lingered for a moment, pressing his palm to the wood. The sensation beneath his fingertips was unsettling, almost warm, almost pulsing. He said nothing. Holmes understood that fear lived in the invisible spaces. As more guests arrived, Holmes refined his methods. He learned to observe without appearing to. He watched how travelers checked in, the nervous tapping of fingers, the hesitant glances at currency, the way exhaustion softened their vigilance. He noted details, occupation, family ties, where they said they were going next. These fragments let him judge who would be missed and how quickly. Some guests, he realized, were ghosts before he even touched them, adrift, unanchored, nameless in a city bursting beyond its seams. But it was not simply the people he studied, it was the building. Certain rooms seemed to draw guests more often than others. Certain hallways made them uneasy, even if they couldn't articulate why. Holmes found himself spending more time on the upper floors, walking in silence, absorbing the strange tension gathering in the walls. The castle was adapting, aligning itself with his intentions. Yet Holmes never believed in supernatural influence. Not truly. He saw the building as an extension of his will, its odd angles and baffling layout tools for manipulation, nothing more. But even a tool can develop a presence if wielded long enough. One night, as Holmes walked toward his office, he heard something unusual. A faint, rhythmic tapping from somewhere above him, 3 sharp knocks in succession, repeated after a pause. His initial thought was that a tenant was hammering a loose nail, but the hour was too late, and the rhythm too precise. Holmes stood still, listening. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, dragging sound that seemed to travel along the ceiling, slowly, purposefully. He felt a cold tremor run along his spine. Annoyance overtook him. Fear was not a sensation Holmes allowed himself. He turned away and descended the stairs, locking the office behind him. The sound did not follow. Still, he made a note of it. Below the castle, in the basement, the air smelled of chemicals and damp earth. This was where Holmes performed the work he could never speak of openly. Here the furnace roared like a metal beast, its glow casting violent shadows on walls lined with tools no doctor should possess. Large vats of acid stood in the corners, their surfaces swirling like trapped storms. Wooden tables with steel restraints occupied the room's center. Here, Holmes perfected the art of erasure. He moved with precision, almost grace, as he adjusted flames or measured fluids. He took pride not in cruelty, but in efficiency. A person, he believed, was only as significant as the impression they left behind, and Holmes ensured that his guests left none. On one occasion, while tending to the furnace, Holmes heard the muffled thud of footsteps above him, heavy, urgent, running along a hallway that should have been empty. He listened with growing irritation. Someone was where they shouldn't be. Someone was exploring. Holmes extinguished the flames, wiped his gloves, and ascended the stairs. The hallway was quiet when he reached it, but he saw immediately that the lock on one of the restricted doors had been disturbed, slightly ajar, as though someone had tried it, opened it an inch, then thought better of continuing. Holmes closed the door gently, leaning forward to examine the latch. A trace of dust had shifted. A faint smear showed where a nervous hand had gripped the frame. Someone was curious. Too curious. Holmes tightened the lock, then turned slowly, scanning the hall. A polished doorknob reflected his face in miniature, pale and expressionless. A gust of cold air brushed against his sleeve, though no windows were open. He exhaled slowly. Fear, he reminded himself, was something other people felt. The next morning he found the curious guest, a young traveler named Emmeline, pretty in a forgettable way, polite, eager to please. She smiled as she greeted him, unaware of how closely Holmes studied the tremor in her hands, the slight stiffness in her movements. She had seen something she couldn't comprehend. Holmes invited her to discuss new employment opportunities at the hotel. She eagerly accepted. Witnesses would later recall seeing Emmeline enter Holmes's office. No one remembered seeing her leave. As the weeks passed, more visitors came to the castle, some never leaving. Drifters and dreamers, women seeking independence, men seeking fortune. Holmes guided them with the same courteous voice, the same gentle posture, the same unwavering charm. He made promises he never intended to keep. He offered help he had no intention of providing. Holmes had spent a lifetime mastering deception, but deception was not what made him dangerous. It was how seamlessly he blended into the world around him. He was not the villain of a story, he was the neighbor of one, a figure so ordinary that no one suspected the magnitude of the darkness inside him. But one person did. Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a large man with a rough exterior, a drinker, a laborer, someone whose desperation made him pliable. Holmes hired him often, used him frequently, manipulated him easily. But Pitezel, unlike most, had a spark of cunning. He watched Holmes more closely than others. He noticed when certain guests disappeared. He noticed when Holmes ordered supplies that no ordinary hotel would need. Holmes was aware of Pitezel's attention. He encouraged it, in fact. Men like Pitezel believed they stood on equal ground with cunning men. Holmes found that belief amusing. Together, they discussed schemes. Insurance fraud, land deals, business ventures with loose foundations. Holmes fed Pitezel's greed like a man feeding scraps to a stray dog, and Pitezel devoured each lie with willingness, unaware of the trap slowly tightening around him. But the castle grew restless. Holmes felt it in moments when the lights flickered without reason, when doors drifted half open on their hinges, when the steady thump of the furnace pulsed like a heartbeat through the floorboards. The building had absorbed too much fear, too much anguish, too much of Holmes himself. It had become something beyond architecture, an echo chamber of everything that transpired within. One night while Holmes walked down the third-floor corridor, a sudden chill crawled over him, sharp as ice pricking the skin beneath his collar. He paused. The air was thick, almost suffocating. A floorboard creaked behind him. Holmes turned swiftly. No one stood there. Yet the faint outline of a shadow, shorter than his, slighter, seemed to linger for a fraction of a second before dissolving into the dark. Holmes blinked, irritated with himself. Exhaustion, that was all. The castle was a labyrinth even he could lose himself in. The mind played tricks in dim corridors, especially on nights when the city's noise faded into an eerie, unnatural silence. Still, as he walked, Holmes could not help but notice something new. The faint scent of perfume drifting from a sealed room, a scent he recognized immediately. Emmeline. He stopped at the door, resting his hand on it. No one since Holmes had held the key. He stepped back and exhaled, steadying himself. The castle was reacting, retaining impressions like fingerprints pressed into soft clay. It was not supernatural, he reminded himself. It was sensory memory, nothing more. But the air did not feel like memory. It felt like presence. Holmes backed away and returned to his office, though he did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his desk writing figures in his ledger, each stroke of ink precise and calculated. The candle beside him flickered, sputtered, then went out. The darkness felt purposeful. Holmes relit the candle. The flame resisted, as though smothered by unseen breath. He frowned. The rational explanation was a draft, a crack in the wall, something scientific. Holmes had lived his life by method, not superstition. But as he leaned closer to the flame, shielding it with his hand, he thought he heard a faint sound behind him, the soft scuff of someone stepping forward on the wooden floor. Holmes straightened. He did not turn around. Instead, he listened. The room was silent. Yet he knew with unsettling certainty that he was not alone. The castle was beginning to close around him, not as a threat but as a companion, a reflection, a mirror made of brick and bone. Holmes inhaled deeply and continued writing. He could not afford distraction now. Chicago was growing suspicious. Journalists whispered about disappearances. Creditors demanded answers. Police asked questions Holmes delayed but could not dismiss forever. And Holmes, ever calculating, was preparing to abandon the castle. But the castle was not prepared to abandon him. It had taken shape under his will, absorbed his intentions, and manifested his cruelty in its very structure. It was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Perhaps more. Holmes rose from his desk and extinguished the candle once more. The moonlight sliced sharply across the floor, illuminating the faint outline of footprints, small, nearly child-sized, leading toward the hallway. Holmes followed them with his eyes. They stopped abruptly at the door. He reached for the knob, paused. His pulse, usually steady, flickered with a rare hint of unease. He opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty, but the lingering scent of perfume and the faint echo of footsteps suggested something else entirely. The castle remembered everyone who entered, and it did not forget them. Not even Holmes. Holmes left Chicago with the calm efficiency of a man closing a chapter of his life. Creditors circled him like carrion birds, detectives questioned him with growing boldness, and rumors swelled through Inglewood that something inside his grand hotel was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He believed distance would grant him freedom. New cities, new aliases, new schemes. The castle had served its purpose. But even as he stepped onto the train that would take him away, he felt a faint pressure in his chest, an inexplicable heaviness, as though the building itself resisted his departure. For the first time in years, Holmes looked back. The castle's silhouette stood rigid against the sky, its windows darkened, its halls silent but expectant. He boarded the train anyway. New crimes awaited him: insurance fraud, manipulation, the trusting companionship of Benjamin Peitzel, whose family Holmes would soon weave into his schemes. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. For months, he traveled under false names, orchestrating disappearances with the same cold precision he had honed in Chicago. Yet even hundreds of miles away, Holmes felt the castle lingering in his thoughts. Not with remorse. Holmes did not feel such things, but with a strange sensation of being watched by something that no longer needed to be physically near him. A hotel could not follow a man. But memories could. Echoes could. And something built from fear and secrecy does not simply fade when abandoned. Holmes learned this the night he checked into a small boarding house in Indianapolis under yet another alias. He unpacked his valise, lit a lamp, and began drafting a letter. But as he wrote, a familiar chill crept across the room, threading itself along the floorboards like smoke. He recognized the sensation instantly. For a moment he stopped writing and listened, truly listened. He heard it then, the faint, rhythmic tapping he had once heard in the castle's upper floors. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. The exact pattern, the exact tempo. It came from the wall behind him, though the room next door should have been empty. Holmes closed his eyes. Impossible, he told himself. Buildings did not carry sound across states. Echoes did not follow men. He resumed writing. The tapping grew louder. Holmes snapped the pen in his hand. When he turned, the room was still, ordinary, the wallpaper plain and peeling, the lamp's flame steady. Yet Holmes remained frozen for several seconds more, his breath slow and controlled, not from fear, but from agitation. Agitation that the past refused to stay buried. Holmes was arrested not long after. The fraud, the forged documents, the growing suspicion surrounding missing persons, all of it converged around him. Detectives began tearing apart the trail Holmes left behind, and inevitably the investigation circled back to Chicago, back to the castle. Holmes sat in custody with an unreadable expression as newspapers blared headlines about the strange building in Inglewood. Reporters described hidden staircases, secret chambers, and rooms stripped of all logical purpose. The public was horrified, riveted, repulsed. Holmes answered their questions with polite indifference. He claimed ignorance. He claimed misunderstanding. But the castle, once silent, began speaking louder than he ever anticipated. Investigators who stepped inside described an overwhelming darkness, a sense of suffocation as though the walls pressed inward. Some grew nauseous. Others reported hearing faint whispers, footsteps, the brush of fabric, distant cries that vanished when pursued. One detective swore he felt a small hand grasp his sleeve in a sealed room with no windows. These were not supernatural tales. They were observations born from human intuition, reacting to a structure saturated with unspoken suffering. Holmes read the accounts with mild amusement. But nights in his cell grew difficult. He began waking suddenly, convinced someone stood beside his bunk. He heard the soft hiss of gas lamps, though none burned in the cell block. He smelled faint traces of perfume. Once, he opened his eyes to find the vague outline of a child standing near the doorway, her face obscured by shadow. Holmes blinked and she was gone. He slept less after that. During the trial, the courtroom filled with spectators eager for a glimpse of the man dubbed the Devil in the White City. Holmes sat calmly each day, his posture immaculate, his confidence unwavering. He delivered speeches with the poise of a lecturer, asserting his innocence, weaving charm into every sentence. But the castle remained a specter looming over him. Each piece of evidence revealed architectural plans, recovered bones, testimonies from former workers, felt like another whisper from the building he had crafted so meticulously. Holmes had intended it as a machine for control, a labyrinth designed to bend others to his will. Now it was bending the world against him. When the guilty verdict came, Holmes nodded as though expecting nothing less. He was sentenced to death.